welcome everybody to this opening keynote talk for our conference, Popularizing STEM, Science and Technology in the 21st Century and US Popular Culture. And I'm very glad to introduce our speaker for it. We'll be in a conversation on science fiction and the art of the possible with Gerry Canavan. Gerry is Associate Professor at Marquette University, where he teaches 20th and 21st century literature in the Department of English. He's the author of the monograph Octavia E. Butler, published in 2016. He's also the co-editor of Green Planets, Ecology and Science Fiction, Cambridge Companion to American Science Fiction, and the Cambridge History of Science Fiction. And he serves as an editor at two academic journals focused on science fiction studies, extrapolation, and science fiction film and television. The format today departs a bit from the traditional keynote, as he will introduce the topics with a short presentation. We will delve into them and open the debate to the public. So without further ado, Gerry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's morning where I am. I believe it's afternoon or early evening where some of you are. So hello to everybody. I'm really excited to be here, help kick off this conference with this keynote and our discussion. I confess some discomfort with the idea of popularizing STEM as a concept. And we talked about this when I was invited to do this. I'm not sure that my work is always necessarily an argument for popularizing STEM. As I talked about with the organizers when we were first talking about this keynote and what the format for it might be, I tend to think science fiction, at least the way I read it, registers concern or dread of science as much or more than the celebration or valorization of science. And maybe that's something we can engage together as the day goes on. You heard my introduction, and these are some of the projects I've been working on. I would love to talk about the Octavia Butler book. Honestly, it was just such a fantastic project. And she's somebody with whom I find myself thinking a lot, especially with regard to the relationship between science fiction and the environment. I'm currently working on a book about Kim Stanley Robinson and his novel Aurora for the Palgrave SSF A New Canon series that Karen Omri and Sean Gines are editing. And I have to admit, my talk wound up being a lot more about Kim Stanley Robinson than I initially expected, but he's really truly been on my mind because I've been kind of engaged in his work so much lately. I'm also continuing to work on a project about science fiction and totality, right? Kind of like cosmic universal knowledge that, kind of originally comes out of my dissertation. I remember during my dissertation defense, my advisor telling me that, science fiction isn't about totality and theories of everything. You're about totality and theories of everything. And the fact that I'm still working on this project 10 years after defending probably suggests that she was right about that. Over time, it's really kind of merged with a project about animals and animal personhood that kind of dovetails with some of my environmental work. So the book has changed a lot, but I'm still trying to kind of figure it out in those terms. More or less everything that I'm working on in some sense is about taking science fiction seriously as an archive, especially maybe when it seems unserious, right? When it seems not to be doing serious things. There's a few reasons I think this is worth doing. As William Gibson, Cory Doctorow, a host of other people remind us, SF is often racing to predict the present rather than the future. A lot of times what we see in kind of science fictional speculation is already happening in different ways, right? We're catching up to the present. And when we think we're talking about the future, it's simply later than we think in some ways. And the second reason I think SF is important is I would suggest it's the prevailing ideology of the United States, perhaps especially in its kind of hyper-capitalist class, as well as our kind of quasi-theological cosmology. It's how we talk about big ideas. It's also the primary language we use when we try to speak back against those ideas, right? When the billionaires talk, what they talk about is often SF, right? Bezos and Musk and Peter Thiel are all talking about immortality and colonizing the stars and all these kinds of like grandiose notions, right? Today it's the metaverse, tomorrow will be something else. And when we talk back against them, we're also kind of talking the language of SF. And the third reason is, of course, that SF has things to tell us about the world outside its unreal or nonsensical specifications or speculations, right? It's a cognitive map in that kind of Jamesonian way that uses strategies like familiarization, allegory, world reduction to help us better comprehend and kind of map our own world. When we were talking about what we would do with this keynote, we landed on this idea of having a sort of dialogue about the relationship between science fiction, STEM, and politics in these terms, right? All three, science fiction, STEM, and politics, are in different ways the art of the possible from my title. And in particular, I wanted to think about something that had a lot of angles to it, a lot of sides to it, something that on some level, good-hearted and rational people can disagree on. And so my mind went to thinking about geoengineering. And that's mostly what I'm going to focus my kind of initial emergency remarks on before we get to the roundtable part and that Q&A. So what is the situation of geoengineering in November 2021? One thing we have this month's COP26 talks, which are characterized by what has euphemistically been characterized as last-minute drama over limiting coal, which led, among other things, to shift the language from phasing out coal to phasing down coal. It would probably be wrong to characterize these talks as a failure, but it would also be wrong to characterize them as a success, right? They're still kind of in this muddy middle where a real agreement that would actually limit carbon in the atmosphere has been reached. We have increasing public conversation and discussion about geoengineering technologies, including a really interesting New York Times story from last month about carbon capture technology that sounded quite promising even to an old pessimist like myself. I also just really like this Harvard Crimson article. Is it time to consider dimming the sun, right? We're talking about all of these ideas, different ways that we might try to tinker with the temperature of the planet if we can't stop emitting carbon. Of course, we have a nonstop parade of climate catastrophes that are too multiple and too grim to even really name, all tokens of a rapidly worsening climate crisis that seems incapable of being solved by the mechanisms of liberal democracy and market capitalism. And yet these are the only tools in our tool belt. We find ourselves sort of trapped in some way, right? So we have the wildfires out west. We have the ice storm in Texas that caused such traumatic infrastructure damage, catastrophic flooding everywhere, right? This image is from Florida, but it could have been from any number of places. The growing reputation and prominence of the work of the great Kim Stanley Robinson, including his late career breakthrough novel, The Ministry for the Future, speaks, I think, in some way to our growing dread over a future that seems hopelessly apocalyptic and our kind of inability to find a way to intervene despite knowing all the facts. For the uninitiated, Kim Stanley Robinson has published multiple acclaimed works in the genre of science fiction, most famously perhaps his 1990s Mars trilogy. He's closely associated with the socialist left, especially with regard to the environment, though the utopian optimism of his work seems perhaps to have been tempered somewhat by disheartening developments in global politics since the 1990s. Many of his post-Mars works are kind of explicitly remixing elements of the Mars works to think about ways that we might think about their terms differently. Aurora, the novel I'm working on, explores the idea of launching an inhabited starship out of the solar system to reach another star, which is Imagine Blue Mars. Galileo's Dream in 2013 imagined colonization of the star system happening, typically with much more destructive anti-ecological speed. Science in the Capital and New York 2140 both explore the climate catastrophe of ice sheet collapse, which also occurred in the Mars books. Red Moon suggests a kind of obvious sort of intertextual relationship with Red Mars. Other noteworthy novels of Stan's explore multiple possible futures for California in the Three Californias trilogy, Life in a Scientific Colony on Antarctica, An Alternate History, in which a much more virulent black plague killed nearly every European on the planet. That's The Years of Rice and Salt from 2022. It's a great book. 2002, a great book. And The Dawn of Humanity at the End of the Ice Age, right? A different moment of climate change. Shaman from 2013. Since the 1980s, Robinson has won the Campbell, Locust, Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards, among other distinctions, demonstrating his importance as a major figure in the field of contemporary science fiction. He's a major writer on SF, and he has been for most of his career. And again, he's especially distinguished by his relationship with environmentalism and environmentalist science fiction, an area in which his work is almost certainly unparalleled, often feeling decades ahead of the rest of the field, and by his focus on the utopian potentialities of SF, which likewise feels nearly unique among his contemporaries and has earned him the distinction of our greatest political novelist by no less an august institution than the New Yorker. And I think that honor is really well-deserved. His most recent novel, The Ministry for the Future, which is pictured, has had an outsized popular reception, unlike any of the others. It's a novel that posits a diversity of tactics in response to climate change, from the debate of elite lawyers seeking to craft new national laws, to a massively distributed cabal of global eco-terrorists bringing down commercial airliners in a day of terror to destroy the airline industry, to geoengineering, to a carbon-based cryptocurrency, to the formation of a new Gaia-based eco-religion that might change the way people think. And it suggests that all of these tactics, all of them together, including political terror, might combine to just barely get us through what's coming for us in the 2020s and 2030s. But the book has been taken up as a kind of key text of the moment, endorsed by no less an institutionalist than Barack Obama himself. It wound up on Barack's Books of the Year list. Robinson has followed up his growing prominence as a public intellectual futurist with a number of high-profile interviews and appearances in the last few years, especially in that last year, including a widely circulated piece, again in the New Yorker, about the way the coronavirus is rewriting our imaginations, and some other pieces from the last 5 years or so that have really influenced my sense of the playing field for ecological politics, both the kind of stirringly unrealistic, right? His assertion that we have to empty half the earth of its humans, the only way to save the planet, right? We've got to get everybody in cities and let the planet rewild, another plan that appears in Ministry, to the more kind of down-to-earth realist polemic, right? The leftist case for geoengineering, both of which, again, show up as major concerns in Ministry for the Future. I truly love the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. I find myself becoming, in some ways, ever more evangelical about it. And I think his work is very precisely about the art of the possible in that kind of best utopian tradition of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. What he challenges us to do across his career is imagine how the wretched reality of the present could produce the conditions for utopia. And I often think of Benjamin's theses on the concept of history when I think about Stan's work. Benjamin writes of the work of the historical materialist as a bid to seize hold of the memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. Robinson's project since the Mars books, since before that even, has been to attempt to seize hold of the future as it flashes up in moments of danger and assert that a better world is possible even in this moment of crisis. Every second of time, Benjamin suggests in that same essay, is a gate through which the Messiah might enter. Every moment has those seeds, Benjamin said, and Stan really seems committed to the notion that ours does too. What I see Robinson doing in his lifelong project is trying to tracing out the seeds of those utopian world transformation. We might not actually take up the seeds. We might not plant them and nurture them. We might not activate these moments of potential. Indeed, as he demonstrates, we often make the worst decisions in moments of severe crisis, not the best ones. But in a Benjaminian sense, the chance is always there. To take something where the very notion of utopia seems almost perverse to discuss, as he suggests in the coronavirus piece, we could recognize in our moment of pandemic the way the coronavirus has suddenly made possible all sorts of transformations in society that had previously been considered unthinkable, including massive downward wealth transfer, including a kind of proto-UBI, universal basic income, universal healthcare, work from home accommodations that have always been declared impossible, new attention to disability and access, a wide variety of labor activisms and kind of micro strikes, verging perhaps in the US on kind of quiet general strike right now, and more. A shared crisis, as nightmarish as it can be, becomes a shared opportunity to rethink our world and the horizons of what is possible, to actually make the better world that we have always preemptively and wrongly concluded we could not. That's a challenge that Robinson offers us across his work, why I find reading him so bracing and energizing and activating, and kind of why I find myself thinking with him so much. There just aren't very many writers who are acutely aware of how bad the human story has been so far, and who nonetheless have the conviction that it could be something different. The SF critic Carl Friedman has suggested that the dialectic between inflation and deflation, between optimism and pessimism, between hope and despair, is the kind of constitutive opposition of both Marxism and science fiction. And I think Stan kind of embodies that idea, right? So deflation is the demystification, the hard limits that chemistry, physics, biology, ecology, economy, history, and so on impose on us, right? The cold equations. And then inflation is inspiration, hope, what most people studying SF for a living would shorthand as utopia. And science fiction in Kim Stanley Robinson's hands is very much the art of the possible, precisely because it promises, it asks us to take seriously the reality principle of those deflationary cold equations, and then demands that we figure out how to get to utopia anyway, at least as close as we can get. And if you know science fiction or you know the study of science fiction, this isn't that different from cognitive estrangement, right? That kind of old Savinian paradigm for understanding the genre, right? Thinking about the way cognition and knowledge and facts and science and defamiliarization, estrangement, difference, right? How they interact to produce knowledge through science fiction. I love this quote from Stan because it applies to so much of the grimmest aspects of the science fiction genre, our kind of perverse desire for them, and then calls on us to find a different way to think about them. It applies to science fiction, to climate change, right, as well as anything else. A call to let the coronavirus, the pandemic, ecological crisis, economic crisis, right, all these kinds of shared moments of disaster rewrite our imaginations and open the door to a different sort of world. And I'll just highlight that last sentence. Maybe we can say that what we need to see the realist situation more imaginatively while imagining what we want more realistically, right? That same kind of dialectical notion. I like this one too from a different piece where he calls on us to imagine harder, precisely because we need to take material reality ecology seriously, right? And it sets out stakes for us, right? The real stakes, the survival of everything we value. Ministry strikes me as a key text for this moment for precisely this reason. It's about saving the future from the perspective of the future, from the perspective of the people of the future who would rather we get our hands a little dirty and win than allow our institution and the rules to prevent us from doing what we must and letting society collapse, right? A call to take the future seriously, not just as a slogan, but as the guiding ethos for everything else we do, right? So this was the meme that I think everyone has kind of latched onto over the last 5 years as the spirit of our age, this kind of spirit of denial that this is fine, dog, right? Declaring that everything is fine as the world burns around him. I saw this one recently and it made me think that maybe it's the new spirit of the age, right? This is a variation of the I bet he's thinking about other women meme, right? I bet he's thinking about other women. No, but what he's thinking is I cannot escape the conclusion that I am morally obligated to blow up fossil fuel infrastructure, right? It reminds me a little bit of Gramsci's kind of time of monsters, right? A new spirit, a new world is waiting to be born, and it may change what we think has to be. It's just amazing that Obama liked this book. I just have to say that. So geoengineering has a kind of double status, both in the book, right, and in our kind of real life predicament. Number one, it's an object of fantasy or desire, right? It's the last chance, as Robinson put it elsewhere, to quote, keep doing what we are doing, but somehow get away with it, right? To find a way to invent a machine that will eat carbon so that we don't have to change anything. It's an object of fantasy. But also, and this is crucial, what Robinson shows in Ministry is that it's an important and likely necessary component of any sort of solution we might develop out of sheer necessity. If nothing else, we've taken too long. We are simply out of time, even if we had the collective will to act, which apparently we still don't. We probably now have to geoengineer, at least to a point, right? Even if that just means planting a lot of trees, despite the dangers. And it's incumbent on us to figure out what that means and what that ought to look like. And I'm going to suggest that a kind of science fictional way of thinking is one of the ways that can happen. Like any great poster, I'm sometimes haunted by my own tweets, including this one, which I think about a lot. If geoengineering can't terraform Earth back to climate stability, I think it will be fair to say that science fiction destroyed civilization. And we retreated this and resaid this in different ways since. Why I've said that geoengineering doesn't work, there's a real sense in which science fiction as a genre destroyed the world. It gave people a vision, a Promethean possibility that was only ever, in China Miéville's memorable phrase, capitalism's bullshit about itself. So much of science fiction today, and this remains unhappily true, is just the deluded wish that when the meal is over, the bill won't come, right? That we're never going to have to think about the environment. We're never going to have to include ecology in the way we think. SF as a genre, in some ways, has convinced us that anything is possible, that human ingenuity, human creative capacity, human inventiveness can create any kind of world. And now we're in a situation where that really needs to turn out to be true, right? The ecological crisis is that dire. And yet, as I suggested later in the threads, SF is the only thing that can save us too, right? So I'm conflicted about science fiction. And so I'm gonna talk about that just a little bit by thinking about geoengineering. If we were trying to decide in some kind of democratic or authoritarian way whether geoengineering is good we'd have to think about a lot of sort of things, right? First, we'd have to think about whether it's safe. All right, is it going to harm us? Is it going to do bad things to us? If it is, obviously we shouldn't do it. Next, we need to think about, is it effective, right? Is it actually workable? Is it going to do what it promises to do? Is it going to pull carbon out of the air? Is it going to lower the temperature of the planet as it raises beyond the constraints through which civilization emerged? Is it cost effective, right? Does it cost more carbon-wise or in other ecological terms than it saves us, right? Is it commensurate with the scope and scale of the problem? Is geoengineering enough? I'm going to suggest it is not. Is it a catalyst for worse problems, right? Is geoengineering going to create physical or chemical or biological backlash effects? Is it going to create political problems, right? As different nations or different agents on the planet decide they want the temperature to be a little bit different, right? Does geoengineering become a new front for international competition or international war? And then finally, the hardest question maybe, is it future-proof, right? Many versions of geoengineering become interventions that can never end, right? We have to continuously do them over and over again, or we get the carbon that's baked in returning and adding to the carbon that we continue to add since, right? The famous example from Futurama that I had on my first page of dropping ever bigger ice cubes into the ocean to lower the temperature, thereby solving the problem forever, right? Geoengineering produces the potential for a doubling or tripling or exponential carbon problem as we do it in isolation, right, without solving the other problems. So we see the science fictional imagination here, right? We model the present, we model the future, we understand the connection between the two, becoming more important as these gates kind of go on, right? Especially in these kind of last two or last three, right? In the end, what we need to do in some sense to decide if we should geoengineer, why we should do it and how we should do it, is to articulate it as a science fiction. And what this process of science fictionality, imagining the potential of geoengineering shows us, I think, particularly that last question, the question of the long now, whether geoengineering could ever be future-proof. What it shows us in the end is that the question of geoengineering is really no different than the problem we have now. Whatever else we do, we simply have to decarbonize, right? Geoengineering by itself, without a kind of agenda of decarbonization, is simply not going to solve the problem and will likely simply intensify it and make it worse. And the simple fact of the matter, science fiction tells us this as well as the evidence of our own eyes, is that we are going to decarbonize one way or the other, right? The easy way or the hard way. And so we need to begin to think in those terms. Science fiction is a big tent. There will always be science fictions kind of doing a multitude of different things. There will always be a market for the kind of most right-wing, billionaire-friendly, anti-everything, anti-human SF. But I really think the most important SF of our moment will be devoted to helping us navigate the ecological crisis in terms of what sorts of better worlds may still be possible, even out of our moment of crisis. And if you haven't read Ministry for the Future, I think that's a terrific kind of example of that. I sometimes feel a little bit like the character from Kurt Vonnegut's God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, who celebrates science fiction with an almost religious fervor. He says, "I love you, sons of bitches. You're all I read anymore. You're the only ones who'll talk about the really terrific changes going on, the only ones crazy enough to know that life is a space voyage, not a short one either, but one that'll last for billions of years. You're the only ones with guts enough to really care about the future, who really knows what machines do to us, what wars do to us, what cities do to us, what big, simple ideas do to us, what tremendous misunderstanding, mistakes, accidents, catastrophes do to us. You're the only ones zany enough to agonize over time and distance without limit, over mysteries that will never die, over the fact that we are right now determining whether the space voyage for the next billion years or so is going to be heaven or hell." And this character has their problems in the novel, but I really think they're right about this. What thinking science fictionally helps us see is a future that is in our hands, that we get to make for ourselves, for better or for worse. I think it helps us think. It helps us grasp both the present and the future a little more clearly than we could otherwise. This is the sense in which I think it is the art of the possible, a mode of art that our unhappy age of economic and ecological omnicrisis, we simply cannot live without. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all and to the rest of the conference. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe we can have a bit of a conversation. Thank you all.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. This was such a great presentation in short. given some food for thoughts to start a discussion on these topics. So I think while the public, we have a good half an hour to talk about this. So while the public comes up with some questions for you, maybe we can just start. I think for sure Michael has more takes on this kind of topics than me. But anyway, I will just start with something that maybe comes from my previous career in building engineering. And it is a bit building on what you said last. So can we really geoengineer? Can we really do this in practice, in concrete terms? And I often feel that we're not that good at doing normal building yet. In most cases, you know, we're still kind of struggling to build normal stuff. So this always seems very overwhelming and overexpensive, and I'm always thinking about what is the sustainability of this, and connecting it to science fiction, as this is the kind of topics that maybe I'm more familiar with in science fiction. Science fiction, I feel, can importantly and fundamentally be a space or a locus for the unfolding of different kinds of futurism, Afrofuturism, post-colonial narratives, Chicanic futurism. So how does all this geoengineering theme fit in there? Because it seems to me that it kind of cuts out many of these realities. It's very often, it really has a feel that it's this kind of techno-billionaire type of project. And it seems, yeah, we have all of these novels in which there's diversity and people live together, different ethnicities and stuff, but in practice, how does this really happen, you know, and is there a place in geoengineering science fiction for this kind of different voices?
Absolutely. Those are two really great observations. I'm going to start with the architecture one. I think my sense of the field is that there's a really interesting thing has happened over the course of the last 20 or 30 or so years, where architecture has kind of ideologically shifted a little bit from thinking about permanence and monumentality to thinking about that buildings eventually have to come down, and trying to think about what deconstructing a building will look like in the end, right? Like so much of what like LEED certification is involving is not just operational, you know, ecologies, right, but also recycling ecologies for when the building needs to come down, right, and needs to be transformed, right? So we're thinking about ecology in that kind of fascinating way in architecture, in a way that was a kind of sea change. And you're absolutely right. Like these are what's being proposed are kind of massive interventions in the system, right? And that they need to be thought through incredibly carefully and you know, in some kind of sense, incredibly conservatively. There are some that are simply building massive tree farms, right? There are others that involve spraying chemicals in, you know, the upper atmosphere indefinitely, right? And those are kind of major, like they're a lot different, right? And you're gambling a lot, right, when you start to do it. The issue is that we have gone so far without decarbonizing at all, right, that it seems inevitable that it will be attempted. I take your second point absolutely, and this was something that I was hoping we could kind of talk a little bit about. There is a way in which this risks kind of reinscribing the kind of worst sort of imperial master of the universe sort of like fantasy to science fiction, right? And on your list, I would definitely include animals that need to be kind of considered in this equation as well. One of the things that's really interesting about Ministry for the Future is that it does kind of understand that many of these geoengineering sorts of innovations are cheap enough that individual, like even our poorest billionaires could do them by themselves, right? Much less individual countries, right? And so the major geoengineer in the beginning part of Ministry of the Future is India, which experiences a kind of massive deadly heat wave and decides that it's simply going to take action to lower the temperature of the planet by itself, right? And this becomes a kind of world scandal in some ways, even though it in some sense it has to happen. You risk either the kind of stomping of difference, as you were suggesting, right? That the kind of imperial metropole will simply make decisions for everybody else, or counterproductive actions where individual groups are trying to set the temperature at different rates, right? Like Russia wants it a little hotter so it can mine the Arctic, right? And India wants it a little colder, right? So its people don't bake to death, right? And so we have like all of these kinds of things that are calling for like a new way to understand like cosmopolitanism, right? And like global encounters, right? And so all of these things need to be part of that kind of conversation in ways that I think are difficult and fraught, but climate change is a global crisis, right? And so you need that globality and you need that locality, and you need those two things in conversation. So it's incredibly difficult. Many of the things, I'm sure Stina will have things to say about this later in the week, right? That indigenous science fiction and indigenous futurism kind of point to are indigenous knowledge practices that we have deliberately forgotten, right? That are helpful, right? For instance, their forestry practices prevented wildfires that we are now prove unable to prevent, right? Because we refuse to do, in some sense, what needs to be done to tend the earth, right? So there are ways to kind of do geoengineering without dropping a lot of chemicals everywhere, right? That are also need to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, Minister of the Future also has this bit of a witness account kind of genre that actually expands a little bit what is the usual character and point of view of this kind of science fiction novels, I guess, that is a scientist that does stuff, while Minister of the Future somehow opens this to a bit of different kinds of perspectives. And do you think that's a good mix between genres? So the witness account turned into science fiction, is it effective in this novel? Does it work?
I mean, there's a polyvocality to it that I think is really powerful. He draws in narrators from all over with huge amounts of backgrounds. I mean, in some sense, it is still kind of focalized through these kinds of intergovernmental elites in the Ministry for the Future, right? This kind of UN organization. But there's a ton of, really fascinating kind of street level perspectives on this, including ones that, do not possess that kind of like white imperial hyper-capitalist kind of perspective on things. I taught it recently. One of the chapters that we lingered on a lot was just this very sad one where, the people who have to move as a result of Stan's plan to move everybody into cities, right? Like they basically gather for their last day in their town, and they have this kind of like, kind of like early funeral for their community. And they're like, maybe someday we can come back, right? But they, there are losses to what is being proposed here all over the place, right? That he tries to kind of incorporate into it, as well as kind of new opportunities, right? Like, as I suggested, one of the striking and almost incomprehensible things about the book is the multitude of international terrorist organizations, right, that make their voice known through terroristic action, right, to prevent fossil fuel infrastructure from continuing to poison the planet, right. So I think it mostly works. I mean, obviously any novel is going to have moments that you would want to critique or tweak, but by and large, he's trying to think globality. That's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, isn't it deterritorialization anyway, often a topic that goes hand in hand with terraforming, geoengineering, these kind of things. That it's not always positive, it's not always wanted, sometimes it's imposed. So this is also an issue that I guess is very timely and real, because there are people that will have to move soon from the places where they live.
Yeah, I mean, something on the order of 40% of the world lives within 5 miles of the ocean, right? It's crazy, right? How much of the planet lives within 100 kilometers, or whatever the number is, and how much dislocation there will be if sea level rise happens faster than it's being projected, right? Even places now that are just kind of permanently flooded, right, in different ways, a kind of permanent intertidal zone that's already happening. So again, that's a political problem. It's a problem of the imagination that we have to think about, right? Like there will be climate refugees in our time. There already are.
And also, just before I give the floor to the first question we have, I was thinking it's very interesting what you just mentioned about the terrorism and this kind of reaction to this type of global problem. And it just reminded me, I was reading a paper that I'm going to think about it and I'm going to put it in the chat, but it was about dystopian fiction in general. And they did this study and people would justify and legitimize violent action, mostly when there was a totalitarian regime in place in the narrative. But anyway, it was interesting how if you tell it in a certain way, people will legitimize and say, yes, you know, when the fight is extreme measures are understandable. And so I was wondering, you think that maybe in Ministry of the Future, Robinson manages to put that kind of theme and that kind of prompt in a different type of narrative. So it's a climate change narrative. It's a less dystopian in the sense of totalitarianism regime, but still there are different types of reaction, and some of them are very violent. So where is the line where you justify or not justify, and the reader feels that it's correct or incorrect or legitimate to you know, use violence?
I think that is a place where the polyvocality of the novel really shines through, because there's just a million ways to read it, right? I think for some people, like if I would speculate, I think Barack Obama reads this and he's like, oh yes, like if we do nothing, then, you know, at some point in the future, people will fight violently to survive, because that's what people do. And so that calls on us to act in the present. I think other people read it and say, like, we tried institutional democracy for 30 years to get any action on this and it didn't work, and now it is time for extra legal protest, right? Whether that's violent or not, right? Whether that's chaining oneself to developments to prevent their execution. Is it, you know, sabotaging different kinds of things? I mean, even Al Gore has suggested civil disobedience inside coal plants and things like that, right? And he ran for president. When I taught the novel, we talked a lot about the day they brought down all the planes, right? The kind of global terror network crashed, you know, 100 planes in a single day. And that's, you know, that's a bitter pill to swallow, right? The idea that you could ever work yourself up into the idea that you would crash planes with innocents on them, right? I don't think most readers of the novel can kind of take themselves to that point, even under this situation. But what the novel posits is that if the stakes are the survival of billions of people, right, then lots of things become on the table, right, that wouldn't ordinarily be. And I think one of the things that makes the book so successful is that it just, it's opening a Pandora's box that people are opening in their private lives and opening in their private conversations, and that no one is talking about, which is like, what are we going to do when every 2 years a bunch of really powerful people go to Rome or Copenhagen or wherever, Paris, and like perform concern for this thing and don't do anything, right? Like, we've been through this routine over and over again. Like, there has to be some kind of new movement. And if, you know, a figure like Greta Thunberg, nonviolent, but just refusing to participate in, you know, this kind of ongoing march to doom, she has the following she has for a reason, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So shall we get Alejandro's question? Sorry, I left you with your hand raised.
No worries, because what you actually touch upon the topics I wanted to comment. But I wanted to ask Gerry if he probably knows the Terraforming project in the Sturka Institute in Moscow.
Not super well. I've heard of it though. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you want to tell.
I wanted to ask about your opinion on it, because it's interesting. At the same time, I have the feeling it is evolving into something that is very eco-fascist in many ways. So for those of you who don't know the Strelka Institute and what this philosopher architect Benjamin Bratton is doing, so he has this book called The Terraforming, and it's basically a book about, well, supporting basic ideas on terraformation, basically. But the thing is, the more I know about this project and about what this guy is doing, and not this guy, but his students are doing, really feels like something to really, I don't know, to listen to, but in a bad way. There is this project they released a few months ago called the Green Military New Deal. I think it's for free online. It's supervised by Benjamin Bratton, but it's all about reconverting the military and the army into a supposedly terraforming force that would help the world in a way to carry out these huge terraforming visions of whatever they are, right? And it's interesting because the arc that it's not going to be a military project, even though it is still a military project. And the way they want it to work is to secure the way the terraforming project works. But what would happen when communities with like indigenous peoples, when they say, okay, we don't want this terraforming project in our territory, what would happen? So I was just curious about your thoughts on the possibilities of ecofascism, although you have already touched upon those things in the previous question.
Yeah, I think it's a serious concern, right? Like there was a fairly lengthy period of time, at least in the US, where people were kind of very unhappy with the notion of doomers, and that they thought it was counterproductive to talk about how dire the ecological crisis was, because it would prompt for people a kind of lifeboat ethics, right, where they would become eco-fascists, right? They would start to become imperial racist eugenicists, right? Like desperately trying to save some sliver of the human race, having already decided that disaster has no solution, right? And so, like, yes, this is the bad version, right, of talking about the environment. The recognition that the U.S. military is the greatest polluter on the planet, right? The single greatest like releaser of carbon in the atmosphere. Like the solution is to demilitarize the US, not to try to somehow turn it into like solar powered, right? We fundamentally, right, it requires transformations that go beyond a simple kind of carbon budget, right? And almost every kind of thing you think about, right, in some sense comes back to a slogan of Stan's, right, which is that social justice is a survival technology, right? That what will make the world function, right, in a kind of ecological future is global equality, and the biggest driver of ecological disaster is inequality, right? The outsized power of the United States and the West, and the outside power of billionaires within it, right? Most of those people, as I was saying in my suggestion that their prevailing ideology of the billionaire class is science fiction, seem to be thinking very hard in kind of apocalyptic terms, right? Either building gigantic bunkers to protect themselves from a collapsing society, or fantasies of moving to outer space, right, to get away from the rest of us as we drown, right? And one of the things that Robinson, suggests is that there's nowhere else to go, right? Like you can't really live in outer space without a healthy Earth, right? And that what has to happen again is a kind of transformation of values on Earth that will include, on some level or another, the transformation of many of our social institutions. He is very interested, actually, in bribing the billionaires rather than expropriating them, right? A lot of Ministry of the Future is about trying to figure out financial instruments that they can make more money being green, right, than being dirty. But there's a limit to that as well. But yeah, I think we need to be on the lookout for what this kind of talk prompts, which is a kind of apocalyptic, like zombie fantasy about making sure that you can kill everybody when the food runs out. That's not. I don't think that's the way we need to think.
Thank you, Alejandro. You have anything else to add?
Oh no, I didn't want to add anything because there was another person, but I just like you just reminded me that there's this article by Andreas Malm about so expropriating the means of carbon production as a solution, as a sort of like a terraforming solution for or at least to help in the decarbonization of the atmosphere. So basically to think of all these means of carbon production of factories and all of that as something that should be nationalized and should be taken control of by the state, but an ecological state, in order to limit emissions in a way. And this is what I think it's an interesting idea that, of course, should be accompanied with many other things, but at least it's a way of not being aggressive in geoengineering terms towards the environment, and at the same time contributing in a way to to the decarbonization of the world. But of course, it's a theory that has its limitations. But this is everything I wanted to say. So we can continue with the other.
Thank you. So we have a question by Tyler, if you want to jump in.
Hi, yeah. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the connection between what you call science fiction thinking and maybe what we could call science nonfiction thinking. So the sort of rhetoric and strategies of representation we might hear around, the same ideas, but in a proper, engineering conference, which must exist somewhere. I guess one thing that strikes me in particular is that the same sort of dilemma that you traced out in your ambivalence towards science fiction thinking as both the cause of a problem and probably, one of the only possible solutions to the problem could also be said of science as well. But there must be some things that science fiction allows us to think that maybe just science thinking wouldn't. How do those two fit together?
That's a great question. My impulse is to go to Suvin. I mean, when Suvin talks about cognitive estrangement and cognition, he says specifically he's not talking about like physics and biology, right? He's talking about history, right? And that it's kind of humanities knowledge, right, that structures and that kind of interdisciplinary like accumulation that the humanities are actually pretty good at, right, of bringing all these things together. Wissenschaft, I think, is the word that he uses to describe them all. And so I think the kind of nexus of historical thinking, political thinking, and scientific thinking that science fiction makes possible is something different than what like pure science can do, right? Like you can model a lot of things, but like the famous meme, right? Like science can tell you how to make a dinosaur, humanities will tell you not to do it, right? Like that kind of thinking. I think science fiction, by narrativizing it, by locating it in people, right, by imagining it emerging over a historical process, helps us kind of temper in some sense like the pure creativity of science, right? But I see them as being in dialogue, and many scientists do this, right? Like many scientists are very cautious about what they're doing, right? And thinking ethically. So I think science fiction is so kind of promiscuous in some ways that it's always starting to turn to other things, right? And so I tend to have a very expansive attitude towards it, but that would be like my first stab at an answer. Can I take Jenny's question in the chat too, because it's kind of related, right? Jenny writes, China Meeville, what China Meeville calls capitalism is bullshit about himself. Well, this is certainly one SF tradition narrative. Isn't there an equally long tradition, in particular a feminist one, of criticizing many of these Promethean fantasies? Not to mention the richness of speculative fiction in the present. I would see Butler as part of such a tradition. Could you please talk a little bit about what you see as the relationship between Butler and environmentalism, or geoengineering more specifically? Yeah, I started gesturing towards this a little bit, and maybe didn't say enough about it, right? Like science fiction is very good in some ways about arguing both sides of the horn, right? Like there's very Promethean and very kind of like right-wing fantasies, and then there's very left-wing critical fantasies too. And Butler is a very fascinating figure who kind of was thinking about the environment as early as anybody else, right? Like when science fiction as a kind of publishing concern, a genre, was thinking so much about computers and about physics, she was saying, no, the real thing is biology and the environment. Like that's we're thinking about the future. And the genre kind of caught up to her, right? We're like in a very kind of like biopunk or eco-punk, solar punk, depending on how you want to imagine it, right? Moment now. And what she sees in the parables, right, is, precisely the kind of predicament we're in now, right? This kind of like intersecting pox of different sorts of political, economical, and ecological crises coinciding to basically like undo like American hegemony, right? Like that's what she describes in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and that's kind of what we're living through now. With, again, different characters within, especially in Parable of the Talents, having different solutions and strategies to kind of think through that, right? Some of them have that old kind of style thing where it's like, oh, we'll simply go to another planet, right? She kind of ran aground on that in her drafts and in her own thinking of it, right? Like she becomes a little bit jaundiced about that as she tried to imagine what it would actually be like to go there. But other people argue instead for, kind of political transformation of the US in different ways that we, because the series is unfinished, we don't necessarily get to see where her final orientation would have been, but it's certainly complicated, right? What she identifies in those books, which are so prescient that they wound up on the bestseller list in 2019, right? 15 years after her death, because they seem to describe like our situation so well, right? Like people have found them to be almost a kind of prophecy. And they are both a celebration of science and a kind of attack on science in equal parts, depending on who's talking in the novel and what they're talking about. And I think that's the best of what science fiction does to us, right? Yeah, her work is incredible. So.
Tyler, you have any extra comment?
Maybe I think that nicely illustrates the remarks you started with about science fiction not being an extension of science, but in some sense almost even the other way around, of science as natural philosophy, of science as a small part of a bigger humanistic project.
Yeah, and I think do we have any one last question from the public? Or as we can almost go to a conclusion, I can ask, well, this is more of a, I don't know, I bumped into this last week or whenever it was that Zuckerberg announced his metaverse transformation. I was just thinking, what do you think about the fact that these billionaires that we have now, they are techno billionaires and they're doing these things and they're sort of, I don't know, promoting market libertarianism as sort of a new kind of, I'm going to bring science fiction to you. I'm going to show you how the future can be. But they all have brought up in different occasions their passion for science fiction. And when they were young boys, they were reading science fiction and so forth. But sometimes it seems they have missed the actual ideological points of the novels they mention. And for example, they have Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg. They've all mentioned the Culture Space Opera series by Ian Banks. So are they actually misreading the novels they mention, or they're just kind of interpreting the meanings that were underlying to their own, let's say, profit or public image? What do you think about that? They are connecting their actions to this kind of novels, and it doesn't seem very coherent.
Yeah, it's a fascinating problem. There was such a funny post that went viral about this just the other day, where the science fiction, it says like, science fiction is talking, and it says like, I'm going to describe for you the Terra Nexus. Do not build it under any circumstances. And the tech billionaire announces, like, we finally perfected the Terra Nexus from the great science fiction novel, Do Not Build the Terra Nexus, and we're going to release it next week, right? Like there seems to be a way in which many of these concepts get taken up in the kind of worst possible context, right? As desirable fantasies, right? Rather than things that we would oppose. And I just think that's, you know, you're seeing that kind of struggle within science fiction everywhere, from like the way the Hugo Awards have become so politicized, right? With different factions of fans arguing for different things, to what gets adapted and what doesn't, by whom and in what way, right? Like there is a kind of struggle over the future that's happening by proxy through the way, like the different fandoms that different people have of different kinds of texts, right? And the way they're being revised. To me, I think, you know, I've always felt that kind of cyberpunk fantasy is ecological in the sense that it emerges in moments of ecological crisis as a kind of consolation, right? Like if we're going to destroy the planet and we can't go to outer space, at least we can go inside the computer and still be rich and happy inside there. And I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that as, you know, the world outside is becoming so terrible, right? Like there's a kind of return to this kind of like hyper technological digital spaces. But I think we're all a lot smarter about it too than we used to be, right? And we understand that what Zuckerberg wants is a kind of universal surveillance state that he can monetize, right? And rather than to somehow bring to us, you know, the metaverse, right? Like that video was kind of absurd in it had no proof of concept of anything. It was simply special effects, right? What he wants is our data. And I think people like have finally come around to understand that about him. But, you know, it's a kind of ongoing, it's a bizarre ongoing thing that half the people look at these nightmarish stories and seem to see themselves as the heroes of them rather than as the villains.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And that video was also kind of creepy. And very, I don't know, 2001, or
Yeah.
I mean, it really felt like something we've seen again and again since the late 19th. So
yeah,
what is he proposing? Old future kind of thing?
right.
I don't know.
We're weirdly out of time, even with the COVID era, right? That like what people are desperate for is like technologies that will allow us to be together, right? Rather than things that we could hook ourselves up to always be alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess we can close as we have gone right to the time we have thought for this talk, and it was very interesting. It was a very good conversation. So thank you very much. I don't know if anyone in the public wants to turn on their camera just to show their faces so you can see a little bit who was watching you. And anyway, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I think it was really great opening keynote for our conference.
Thank you all for coming. I was just typing. I'll see you at later events in the week, but thank you.